Hi guys, I'm Kasha. Welcome to the channel and welcome as always to our coffee times to discuss movies and horror. And today I am here to talk to you about a new Spanish horror film called The Communion Girl.
It's coffee time!
The original title is La Niña de la Comunión and it has been directed by Victor Garcia. Previously, the director also did All the Good Ones Get Away. He directed other horror movies like Return to the House on Haunted Hill, Mirrors 2, Hellraiser Revelations, and The Damned. So he has a lot of experience when it comes to the horror genre. And he was also a second unit director in the newest kind of Netflix spin-off Bird Box Barcelona. So he has experience, like I said, and I was excited to see what he was going to do with his new movie, also because this one was filmed completely in Spanish. This is almost The Curse of La Llorona meets The Ring in this new kind of Spanish folklore tale about an urban legend. It did premiere in Spain in theaters back in February 2023, but it has just landed in the month of August on Shudder, so now a lot of more people have access to it. The film is indeed based on a true story, and there were some programs in TV and stuff in Spain talking about this specific case. I'm gonna leave down below a link to an article that discusses the real case that the inspiration came from for the urban legend of the Communion Girl that indeed did disappear in Spain in a small town. So if you want to check it out, the article, I'm gonna leave it down below for you guys. We are in May 1987. Following the first communion of Sarah's younger sister Judith, Sarah and Rebe are on their way back home, returning from a nightclub and after having taken drugs, when they find a doll wearing a communion dress. From that moment on, their lives will become a living hell. There have been many horror movies that use the trope of a haunted doll or a puppet, and this is another one of them. And this is a horror trope that, if we are honest, is going to stay for a very long time because it is also a trope that tends to be quite effective. And The Communion Girl is a Spanish movie that also features a haunted doll, and even though there is nothing really new added to the trope, it did have some good moments. The Communion Girl is set in the late 80s, and to be honest, I don't think it is extremely relevant to the story in general, but I did like to see that period time in Spain because that's when I was a kid. And there are still some things that I can remember from my own teenage years, like, you know, this kind of disco, going to a disco when you live in a really small town, because I come from a very small town, and, you know, traveling, adapting in a small town. And for me, you know, the time period really worked. I really like to see movies set in the 80s and 90s. Normally I prefer movies where the time period has an important significance, plays a role into the story, which was not the case here, but I still enjoy the aesthetics. Sarah is new in town and she meets another girl called Rebe, and they decide to go out one night to a disco, and they need to go, you know, with someone's car. They need to take a ride with someone to get to the disco. That's what happens when you live in a very small town in Spain, especially in the 80s. So after enjoying the party at the disco and also taking some recreational drugs, they are on the way back home. We have our two female characters that are now accompanied by two males are driving the car, and on the way back home, one of the girls, she thinks she saw a little girl dressed in white, which is something, you know, that you know from The Woman in Black, you know, the legend of the girl at the curve, like all of these things. And they decide to stop the car, take a look, and what they find is a communion doll. This communion doll is something that the parents would give their daughters on their first communion to pose for a picture as a present to celebrate this first communion. So every girl will get one of these dolls, and they find an abandoned one. They assume some of the girls has lost it and decide to take it with them Big mistake, we all know this. You don't mess with this kind of objects if you find them in a forest in the middle of the night after suspecting of seeing a ghost. You just don't take it home. Obviously, after taking the doll home, the 4 people that were in the car that night that saw the doll start having nightmares. Even though the movie has recycled ideas, I think that it is well executed, and I did enjoy the chemistry between the 2 main female characters. I think they did a really good job when it comes to their performance. Also, the supportive characters like the parents or the other friends, I think added to the story a lot, and like in general, like from a performance point of view, I really did enjoy it. The film did achieve that kind of atmosphere of an isolated small town where everybody knows everybody's business, and I think that they did a really good job at building up a little bit of tension here and there. And the pacing was good, but it is a movie that is going to be quite predictable, especially if you have seen a lot of movies with this trope. The film lacks originality, relying on horror cliches that have been seen over and over. The film features, teenagers partying, parents that don't believe them, and predictable jump scares. It is also not always needed to do something new in a film, as long as you are telling the story in a compelling way, in a way that is very impactful. And I feel like that punch is what this movie was missing. It's not like, oh, you're just not original, so it's not a good movie. It can still be a really good delivered film using cliches and tropes that we have seen in movies before. But when it comes to that delivery, I just didn't feel like this movie really packed the punch. And that was a little bit frustrating for me, because I know that the director has been involved in the horror movie industry for years, and I was kind of hoping that he was going to either bring something a little bit fresh to the tropes, or that he was going to tell the story in such a compelling, riveting way that I was going to be blown away by it, but unfortunately it was not the case. Of course, our main characters are trying to figure out who this doll belongs to, and they end up kind of digging an old story, an urban legend that people in town know about and that they are all a little bit scared of, which is the story of this communion girl that disappeared, which is, as I've mentioned before, based on an actual true story. And all the hints are taking them into one specific direction, but I feel like the director was hesitant to close the movie. I don't know if he is aiming for a franchise here or a sequel or whatever, but I felt like the director didn't know exactly how he wanted to end things at the end of the day. Since this movie doesn't really have such a tight screenplay, I think that they were really centered around the horror tropes and making sure that they delivered enough horror for the horror fans, and maybe they kind of overthought a little bit, and they ended up, bringing up way too many horror cliches that the only thing that happened was that the horror was so predictable that the scares didn't work, at least not for me. So even though some images were disturbing and I enjoyed seeing them, I was never surprised or scared. But I did enjoy that they took kind of like a Spanish urban legend and they took that and integrated this in a horror film. I always love when you see like a cultural side of a country, especially for me, Spain, obviously, because sometimes I'm familiar or not familiar with certain urban legends. So I do love to see them brought to the big screen. I do have to praise them for kind of trying to use a lot of practical effects. That is something that I'm a huge fan of. I'm always in favor of practical effects over CGI, even though I am aware that sometimes is a budget thing. The ghost design, the creepy moments, and the death scenes, they were just not enough to save this horror film from being generic. And it's kind of like just a Spanish kind of take on a Hollywood film about a haunted doll. So sadly, at the end of the day, I could only give this movie a 2 out of 5. And I think this is going to be a movie for those moviegoers that watch a horror movie here and there occasionally, and people that are just satisfied with a kind of like a typical cliche jump scare film. If you're looking for that one day, then you can check this one out. But I feel like there are many other amazing movies on Shudder and other platforms at the moment that are better than this one. So, you know, watch it if you're interested in the legend, the urban legend, and read the article that I have linked down below. I am someone that loves urban legends and podcasts about that, so I enjoyed the part of the, you know, telling the story of what actually happened, even though this is fictional. Obviously, it's just based on the true story. And personally, I was also not a fan of the ending of the film, which is something, you know, that some people might like, some people might not like. It didn't work for me. I was not a fan of the ending, which also affects obviously my rating, because if I get to the end of a movie and then I get like disappointed with the way it's ended, which is not always easy to end a film. Let's put it also out there. It's not always easy to bring something to closure. I just did not like the way that the director decided to end things. So anyways, you guys, let me know down below if you were aware of the film, if you in general enjoy Spanish horror. Let's talk about it in the comments down below. Thank you guys as always so much for watching, and I hope to see you all as always in our next coffee time. Bye!